Westfield, New Jersey, December 7th, 1971, was a day many people would never forget. It was discovered a family was murdered in their home, with only their husband surviving. John List was missing, and he would remain missing for almost 18 years. Hi guys, and welcome to my podcast. I'm your host Lulu, and today's episode is about John List. This is a case that I just recently came across listening to another True Crimers podcast, and it just really struck me in a different way. It's really hard to just be able to up and leave and go missing without ever being found. And I understand 1971 was a while ago, but I still feel like it was very hard, even then, to be able to just disappear. And this man did just that. He disappeared for so long, and honestly, he almost got away with murder. So we're gonna start with his background. We're gonna go a little bit into depth of who John List was as a child and who he was born to. John List was an only child. He grew up alone with no siblings, and he was born to the parents John List and Alma List. Here we go again with more of the same first names as our main character and another family member. He was born on September 17th, 1925. His father was a devoted Lutheran, and John followed in his footsteps as well, becoming a Sunday teacher. As John grew up, him and his mother were always very, very close. It's recorded that oftentimes John's mother would give him really whatever he wanted. She loved to spoil her only child, and with any chance she got to help him out or really just give him what he wanted, she would. And I do understand that, especially if she knew she would never have another kid. I do know after our last child, and we had decided we probably weren't going to try again, that I've really had to watch how I treat our second, because I don't want to spoil him just because I know he's our last child. So in her situation, I do understand spoiling her first and only child, because she's never gonna have another one, and it's just kind of, I don't know, a motherly instinct, I guess you would call it. But John's father, on the other hand, was a lot more distant. He was a lot more traditional. He wanted John to be able to go and do work for the things he wanted and needed. He did not believe in just handing John anything and everything that he ever wanted, and I also understand that. You want your children to grow up and be able to take care of themselves because you're not going to be there their whole life. But John's father kind of went off the deep end with that thought process, and he very much just felt a lot more cold, which made John, flock towards his mother more because she was more caring and would really give him anything that he wanted. After he grew up in that household, he actually decided in 1943 that he wanted to join the United States Army, and he would later serve in World War II. Which to me is kind of an interesting leap, to go from literally getting everything you've ever wanted and needed from your mother to going to serve in a war. I feel like that is a very large leap because you're I know you're not on your own in the war, but you kind of have to work for the things you want and need while you're around that. And yes, you have your crew and you work together, but you don't get everything handed to you. So I feel like that's kind of an interesting decision that he made. He was discharged in 1946, and then he decided to enroll and earn his bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's degree in accounting. He attended the University of Michigan, and after he graduated, he actually met a widow named Helen, and soon after he married her. And in John's opinion, it always felt like this relationship was very strained. They had only been dating a short period of time and sleeping together when Helen had informed him that she had fallen pregnant. And because John was a devoted Lutheran, just like his father was, he decided the best plan of action would be to ask Helen to marry him. But because this was so rushed, it made John feel like the proposal and marriage to Helen did not go as planned, and he did not want to really go through with this in this way. That obviously put a lot of strain on John, and it actually made it even worse because once they were married, Helen had decided to break the news to him that she was not pregnant, and she actually never was. So she kind of just lied to him to get him to tie the knot so that he couldn't leave, which made John feel betrayed and lied to, and I do not blame him at all. That is not something that you joke about, much less straight up lie about. I totally understand where he is coming from with being angry at her. The big downfall now was that John couldn't leave Helen because of his beliefs. Once married, he needed to stay married, and I feel like that's why Helen decided to pull that pregnancy card on him, even though it was a lie, so she could, seal the deal. Even though he felt lied and betrayed to, he decided to stick with his beliefs, and they stayed married. And that's where they moved on to actually having children. With the 4th year of being married, they had brought 3 children into this world. And with so many children that John now had to feed, he then felt an immense pressure to provide for the family, to give them the best life that he could. He had to feed them, he had to hold a house down. He was the breadwinner, the man of the house. But John could not hold a job for a very long period of time. He was let go a lot. And oftentimes this would be the result of his personality. He rubbed people really the wrong way. And he was a hard worker, but most of his bosses did not feel like they could go up and really have a conversation with him. They didn't feel like they could talk to him or approach him or even get along with him because of how off-putting his personality was. This led a lot of his bosses to just decide to let him go and fire him, even though he was a hard worker. Despite this bad luck, he finally landed his dream job as a vice president at a bank in New Jersey. Now, with this massive pay raise, it seemed as though John and Helen's problems were all over, and they were going to quickly live how they had always wanted to live, and John was finally going to bring the life to his children that they deserved. John left Helen to begin looking for new homes for them, and she quickly found one that she fell in love with, but it was in the most expensive part of town. It was a 19-room mansion, and she insisted they purchase it even though they really couldn't afford it, even with that massive pay raise. But John, already being under immense pressure, did not want to start a fight. So instead, he went to his mother that doted over him and asked her for a loan to purchase the house. His mother agreed in exchange for a self-contained apartment on the 3rd floor of the house that she could also live in. He happily agreed because he's always gotten along with his mother, and they purchased the house and they all moved in. And this really is where things started to get even worse for John. Their problems did not end when the family thought they would. In fact, they got much worse. John got fired from that bank job in less than a year of working there, because of the same reasons he's gotten fired so many other times before. His boss did not feel like their personalities could get along. And because of what happened, John didn't feel as though he could go home and face his family. He was supposed to support them after all. He just couldn't go home and face his family and inform them that he lost another job, and a job that was going to help them out so much. So instead of telling his family and being honest, he decided that he would just wake up every day, dress in his bank attire, eat breakfast with his family like nothing has happened or was going on, and head out for the day. But because he was no longer working for the bank, he would head right to the train station. He would ride for a few stops, get off, and repeat the process on another train, all the while looking for another job. And then, when he found another low-paying job that brought in a little bit of money for some time, he worked there for a while, still without telling his family, until he lost those jobs. And that's how this vicious cycle started. Ride the train, get a low-paying job, lose the job, then back to riding the train, and because of his family's huge home and high expenses that they were now creating, these low-income jobs could not keep up with this ever-growing debt that John was accumulating. So, John began stealing money from his mother's account without her knowledge. But then, John was finally bankrupt in 1971. Which put even more strain on John because he felt as though poverty was a sin in and of itself. And now his children were teenagers, and they also seemed to be turning towards a lot of the sinful cultural attractions the 1970s were creating. His daughter, Patricia, had expressed how she had wanted to go into acting. There were also rumors in the home that she was beginning to dabble into witchcraft, and she was using marijuana. All of these were very sinful in John's eyes, and on top of all the sins his children were becoming involved in, Helen's health began quickly declining. Helen had been keeping the extent of her sickness hidden from John, who she still believed to be providing for the family and going to his bank job every day. She didn't want to put any more stress on him because he was the sole provider for the family, so she had chosen not to inform him of her health. But things started happening where she couldn't hide the extent of it anymore. She started having blackouts and falling down episodes. Her vision was beginning to go completely in her right eye, and she began to drink very heavily to try and control, or at least feel like she could control, her spiraling health. And she quickly added tranquilizers into that alcohol addiction and quickly became addicted to those as well. Finally, though, some tests came back from her doctors that revealed she was suffering from untaken care of syphilis that was the cause of all of these health issues she was having, and that her first husband had actually given it to her prior to his death without her knowledge. So at least she had an answer now, but she was still very sick, and she was still addicted to those tranquilizers and drinking at this point. Now, I don't want anybody to think I'm on John's side. Anybody who's gonna go and honestly kill anybody is never the good guy in my eyes. But I can see how stressed this would put John. Imagine he probably had a plan for his life, and literally everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. I mean, he married a woman shortly after they began dating, and he could have never even loved her. She lied to him about being pregnant, and then just John kept losing job after job after job, and then his wife is sick, and she starts drinking and using tranquilizers, and he feels as though his children are becoming sinful and doing all of these sinful things. I can definitely see in John's eyes how he would be under immense stress. But the way John deals with this stress is not okay. A healthy person would seek therapy. A healthy person would have told his wife that he lost his job and they needed to sell the house. But John's not a healthy person, and John's actions are not healthy. And what made his situation even worse, as if it couldn't get worse for John, his wife stopped attending church with him. Now remember, John is a devoted Lutheran, and so the fact that his wife stopped coming to church with him is a major problem. Now, John had thought and contemplated suicide many, many times, but his religion once again stopped him. In his religion, according to him, that was the one unforgivable sin. And even though he had been through so much stress for this family, he still wanted to see them all in heaven. He wanted to join them in heaven. And if he killed himself, he was not getting into heaven. So every time he contemplated these thoughts, he knew he would never see them again. And he didn't really want that. And that's when John decided the best way to save his family and give him the best chance to see them in heaven was to take their lives from them before they buried themselves in a hole of sin with his own hands. The morning of the murders, on November 9th, 1971, John woke up like any other day. He ate breakfast, just like he did every morning with his children, and waved them off to school. He then walked to his car, and instead of leaving to go to his quote-unquote bank job, he loaded his 2 handguns with ammunition and returned inside to wait for Helen, who was 45 at the time, to wake up for the day and come downstairs. She had morning coffee every day, so John knew that the first place she would go was the coffee maker. And he was right. When she woke up and came downstairs, the first place she walked to was that coffee maker. While she made her morning coffee, they made some small talk, talked about their day, their plans, and when he thought the time was right, he walked up behind her and shot her in the side of the head with a 9mm pistol that his father had given him before passing. The shot killed Helen instantly, and once she hit the floor, John knew she was dead. He then decided to move her body. He moved her body onto a sleeping bag and drug her to the ballroom of this huge home. And then afterwards, he remembered his mother was still in the house, in the apartment upstairs, fixing her own breakfast. He made a decision. He headed up to pay his 84-year-old mother that he loved dearly, who devoted over him and gave him anything he wanted, a visit. John was on a high. John felt like a savior to his family. And he kissed his mother when she asked him what the noise was that she had heard downstairs. Instead of answering her question, he put the gun above her left eye and pulled the trigger. John realized, too late, that his mother was too heavy for him to carry downstairs. He had a plan. He was going to put his whole family together in the ballroom as their final resting place. But he could not get his mother down to the ballroom. So he decided his best option was to just toss a towel over her face so he didn't need to look at her and leave her there. John returned downstairs to assess the damages that had been done in the kitchen after shooting Helen. There was a lot more blood than John had expected there to be. So he began to clean up the blood while he thought about his next steps in his plan. As his children attended school, he decided to write letters and made multiple phone calls to some family, his current boss at one of those low-end paying jobs, and the school to inform them that the family was leaving for a very long time to North Carolina to help out a sick relative. He then headed to the post office to mail the letters out that he had written and stopped the mail delivery to his home. Afterwards, he stopped the milk deliveries and the newspaper deliveries as well, so nothing would be coming to their house and raising suspicion. After all, if the milkman came every single day to leave milk on their porch, and it kept growing and growing and growing, after about a week, somebody would notice nobody was taking the milk in. But if the milk never showed up, nobody would have reason to suspect anything, right? Once he was done with all of that and the children were still in school, he decided to arrive to the bank and cash his mother's savings bond of about $2,000. By this point, John knew he couldn't change his mind. He was saving his family, or so he thought. With money in hand and his savior high at a peak, he arrived back home and ate a sandwich for lunch at the same table he had shot his wife at just hours before. He ate his sandwich, knowing his dead wife and mother was sitting in the home with him, while he waited for his children to finish their last day at school. After his lunch, John got an early phone call from Patricia, who was 16 at the time. On the phone call, she informed her father that she wanted to be picked up early because she was not feeling very good. So, his plan was coming into action quicker than he expected. And he couldn't have been more happy about that. So, he headed to the school. He picked her up and drove her home as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Once they entered the home and John shut the door behind him, he pointed the gun at her jaw and shot her, sending the bullet through her brain. This time, he used his .22 pistol he had kept from his time in the war. She hit the ground, and John drug her body on a sleeping bag, just like he did with his wife, to be laid next to her mother. At this point, John had murdered 3 people. John was considered a serial killer. But in his mind, he was considered a saint. Soon after cleaning up, after murdering his daughter, Fred, his son, who was 13, arrived home. Just as the others, as soon as Fred shut the door behind him, John shot him in the left temple. He fell down, instantly dying as well, and Fred took his body, on a sleeping bag, to the ballroom to be with his sister and his mother. It was getting easier for John. Shot, move, clean up. Shot, move, clean up. And after his son, the only person he needed to finish off was his 15-year-old, John, his other son. Now, he was John's favorite child, who also carried the first name of himself and his father. His son, John, had soccer practice that day and arrived much sooner than John was prepared for. He had left soccer early, which is not anything John was ready for. Once his son John came into the home, he saw the mess that his father had created. Not the bodies, just the blood. There was a short struggle, with both Johns trying to get the upper hand, and unfortunately, his father gained that first. Being much larger and having done this multiple times already, it wasn't hard for his father. He pulled the trigger on his favorite son. But just like how John had put up a struggle to survive, his body did not go as peacefully as the others. It was an instant. His body jerked and twitched as he hit the ground, causing his father John to empty 10 more rounds from both guns into his head and chest. Now, he didn't want any of his family to suffer, and he was worried that the twitching meant his favorite son was still alive, and it very well could have been that way. And finally, once he was sure that little John was dead, he loaded him on the same sleeping bag he had used for the rest of the family and brought him for the family reunion to die for, literally. Once the family, besides Grandma, were all in the room, John straightened their bodies out and put them exactly where he wanted them to be. Once they were positioned how John wanted them to be, he said a prayer over their dead bodies, feeling more like a saint than he had his whole life. He just sent 5 people to heaven and saved them from the sins of this world. At least that's what he thought. But then John cleaned the whole murder scene from top to bottom. That's proof that John knew he was doing something wrong. You don't just clean and hide things if you're a saint, right? After the prayers and his family was dead and everything was cleaned, John ate dinner, just like he did every night. He washed his dishes, just like he did every night, and he slept in the billiards room better than he had slept in years, with 5 dead family members in the same house. The next morning, he woke up and began to prepare to leave. But before he left his home and his family for the first time, he sat down and wrote a detailed letter to their church pastor where he confessed to everything. In this letter, he had wrote about how his life had just fallen apart, and there was sin at every turn, how deep in debt he was, and how he did not know how he was going to get out of it. The profession he went to school for just kept destroying himself, and his life was just falling downhill. And when he was done, he left it on the kitchen table and left, locking the door behind him, turning all the lights on, and dropping the AC to its lowest setting. He partnered all of that with blasting music over the home's intercom at its highest volume so that it looked like people were home and living there. John had also cut all of the faces out of every single one of the family's photos so that they wouldn't have anything to go off of that looked like him. The AC on was used to preserve the bodies and slow decomposition so that they wouldn't stink as soon. The lights and the music were to convince people that there was people living there and moving around, and the faces were so that nobody could find him. He was trying his best to keep people off of his tail. You cannot tell me that he did not know what he was doing. He knew he wasn't being a saint, even though he felt like he was, because he was trying to hide his tracks for as long as possible. Once he locked that door and drove away from the home that he once shared with a beautiful family, he left for good. He took his vehicle to the John F. Kennedy International Airport and left it there. He then took a bus back into the city and boarded a train to Denver and left for good. Once in Denver, he applied for a new Social Security card by the name of Robert Peter Clark and was able to obtain one somehow. Using the new Social Security card and the new name, he applied and got a job as a fry cook. He then followed that by applying and getting the job as an accountant at H&R Block, and that is how he began his new life. He followed that with marrying another widow in 1985 named Dolores Clark, and nobody ever suspected anything. He had never made anybody feel like he was hiding something, much less a secret this big, except for one neighbor. She had seen the story and a photo of John in the tabloids about the attack. She'd read about it and recognized him, and she knew that it had to be the man that she knew, her neighbor, but decided at the time to not call the authorities, making it take years before they would ever catch him. And that is where we're going to leave this story today. Next time, we're going to go ahead and get into the investigation of John, how they found the family, how long it took for them to find them, all the dead ends, and how John got away with murder and being a serial killer for years. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. There may be false or misleading information throughout this podcast. All facts have been researched to the best of my abilities, but accidents do happen. If this is a story you are interested in knowing more about, I highly recommend doing your own research. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.